That was a wonderful and comprehensive discussion highlighted by its breadth, depth, and candor. What I heard was religious freedom as a new issue of sorts that is increasingly elevated and integrated into U.S. foreign policy, but in an uneven and inconsistent manner. In fact, the State Department, with notable exceptions, perhaps in Laos and Vietnam, is still practicing the wrong approach. And USCIRF, while it provides a space to raise ignored issues and talk about issues that nobody's thinking about, is still not being listened to by too many people. And so in the response to the questions that we have over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I wonder if each of our presenters could, in our superficial and shallow DC way, assess or provide a grade for the last 10 years, just in terms of what do you think we've done with these 10 years. And as we open the floor to questions, I do want to raise some of the issues that have been brought out by the various discussions that I think bear further thought. One, what does the State Department or should the State Department outsource its moral imperative? What is the nature of public-private relationships in promoting religious freedom? Does the American government focus too much on Christians? I think that's a very real issue to think about, and I can tell you whether you agree with that or not, that is the perception overseas. Is religious freedom highlighted too much? Is it number one in a hierarchy of human rights such that other human rights are diminished by default, or are they a blendless seam of things? And as Tad said, do you really have to engage in order to encourage? I think that's something that bears further thought for all the instruments of U.S. power. And the last thing that I would call your attention to is what Will said, and the idea that religious freedom can be a diagnostic but also an early warning system for future conflict. And in that sense, as the National Security Strategy of 06 has noted, is religious freedom actually the ultimate counterterrorism tool of some sort? So with that, we're going to open the floor for questions. We'll go until about 10:45, 10:50, take a 10-minute break, and then go to the next session. Father. There's a mic behind you, sir.
Sorry. Right, former Foreign Service and now at part-time at Catholic University. I didn't hear anything at all about the military aspect, particularly the on-the-ground responsibility that many of the NATO and other American troops have to look after those who are being threatened because of their religion, especially in the Iraq situation. I wonder if any of you might have any comment here. Is the Department of Defense in any way involved in the presentations or in the legislation?
Stab, you want to? We all may have a few things. Good question. I alluded to it with my comment on the President's Commander-in-Chief at the beginning, but then didn't elaborate at all. DOD has had some roles in sort of kind of the broader question of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy in a few interesting ways. For one, you know, if you look at kind of the foreign assistance budget, the Defense Department has a tremendous amount of financial resources at its disposal. And in their kind of long war counterterrorism shop, they're actually doing some interesting programming supporting, you know, peaceful Muslim reformers in certain countries as kind of a religious freedom question. So there's been, insofar as they're kind of expanding their own strategic horizons for the ideological nature of the war on terror, there are some, like I said, oblique religious freedom principles being implemented there. Another sort of interesting angle that's a little delicate to talk about, but Bob, you may have some comments on this as well, is looking at countries that have been taken off the CPC list, ones that were initially designated as a country of particular concern and then later came off. Afghanistan was taken off the list in 2002 after the U.S. bombing campaign toppled the Taliban government. And I was with Ambassador Hanford at his press conference announcing in 2002 that Afghanistan was being taken off, and some cheeky French reporter, you know, had the question, "Oh, so is the only way to come off the list to get bombed?" You know, and there's sort of uncomfortable, you know, grimacing. Well, in 2003, 2003, Iraq was taken off the CPC list after being, again, after the U.S. Military campaign toppling the Saddam Hussein regime. That's not the sort of precedent that we would like to be setting, obviously. And fortunately, more recently, Vietnam was taken off the list after some, peaceful diplomacy, and sort of can have a combination of carrots and sticks, but none of them involving the coercive use of force. At the same time, going back to my comments at the beginning about religious freedom violations, religious persecution often being connected with security threats, that also was the case, again, with Afghanistan and with Iraq. So that's why these issues are fairly related. Bob, was Serbia ever a CPC? Yeah. Okay, well, another one that came off the list after a bombing campaign. So,
but they weren't countries.
yeah.
It was Milosevic's portion of Rump Yugoslavia. It was the Taliban in Afghanistan. It wasn't a country.
Yeah, regimes of...
Right. So I think there's a difference. Now you can say, well, Iraq maybe might prove that point. First of all, we spent a lot of time talking about chaplains because we felt it would be important for chaplains who have these discussions all the time with the troops under them, should know exactly where the United States stands, what it's trying to do, and so on. And I would say that the military, by and large, if you look at the military compared to every single entity in the process, in this Washington think tank kind of environment, the military gets it better than anybody, understands it better than anybody. I mean, you may go into Congress and they don't know what a difference between a Sunni and a Shia is, but you bet that the commanders in the field do, because they have to. So I always found the military further ahead on human rights issues, especially as they're trying to teach the culture of a country that they're going to be thrown up against in combat situations, better than anybody else. I mean, I think the military could put some of our State Department folks to shame, for example, or other folks in that food chain that exists when we're supposed to have an integrated foreign policy. So I'd give the military high marks. I think there's still an awful lot that can be done with the chaplains. As you might imagine, the chaplains report to people as well, and they normally had a full agenda by the time they got to me. But I always had an audience when I went to talk to the chaplains. They wanted to hear this. They wanted to be helpful.
We had, just very briefly, and here I get to tell my anecdote. Shortly after the U.S. Military action in Afghanistan, we went in to talk to some senior State Department officials about the importance of promoting religious freedom in the new political context there. And we made our whole spiel, and then we got to the end, and this person, who will remain nameless, turned and said, well, I understand everything that you're saying, but let me ask you one question. Afghanistan, it's almost 100% Muslim, so what's the religious freedom angle? I mean, what's the religious freedom problem potentially there? So I think that the military on the ground does have to deal with religion constantly in those environments, and I'm no expert in assessing how that's done. It's encouraging what Bob has said, but that's extremely important. And as U.S. military is going to be engaged around the world, it's very important that they understand what's going on and to take decisions keeping that in mind.
Let me just add one comment there. I was speaking at the first ever Religious Cultural Awareness Training Program for Air Force chaplains last week at Air University at Maxwell, and also did a pilot program down at Fort Bragg for our Special Forces folks and Civil Affairs folks. I would echo what my father said in the sense that the military gets it because they have to. They're engaging the world as it is on the front line of foreign policy in some of these conflict zones. So they adjust from the corporal to the captain at the checkpoint. They have to know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. But this is still a very difficult thing to engage and intentionally educate and train for. By very nature of the fact that these pilot programs these last 2 years, we don't know what to do. General Petraeus has said his chaplains will be the point of religious cultural liaison in Baghdad. That is still not joint doctrine, and the chaplains are pushing back because they care for the spiritual welfare of the troops. But the question is, if not them, who? Just like if there's no other place in the State Department to think about religious freedom as a function of counterterrorism, it goes to the IRF office. And they're pretty busy. So this thing about religion and culture in our foreign policy is a much bigger issue that has to be thought about more comprehensively. And I would also argue that the international relations schools, whether it's Fletcher or Georgetown or SAIS, need to think about it very carefully. And that, of course, is how Tom Farr came to be here through Luce.